The summit in Switzerland is over, and President Biden and Russia's President Vladimir Putin are headed home tonight. As expected, there were no large breakthroughs. Instead, both sides cast the talks as businesslike. White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor reports from Geneva.
A historic high-stakes summit between the U.S. and Russia. It began with a handshake at the doors of an 18th century villa.
Will you find common ground?
On the shores of Lake Geneva, President Joe Biden spent hours with Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Biden said the meeting was constructive and that neither party made overt threats. But Mr. Biden did say he made it clear that Russian attacks on the U.S., cyber or otherwise, would lead to grave consequences.
I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond.
President Putin called the summit, quote, very constructive. Still, he took no responsibility for the cyber attacks from Russian criminals that have targeted U.S. infrastructure, and he dismissed questions about Russian military aggression in Ukraine. Before the meeting, both leaders said relations between the U.S. and Russia are at a new low. But today began with the two sounding hopeful.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank you for your initiative to meet today. I know that you've been on a long tour. Still, U.S. and Russian relations have a lot of issues accumulated that require the highest level meeting, and I hope that our meeting will be productive.
Well, thank you. As I said outside, I think it's always better to meet face to face.
President Biden referred to the U.S. and Russia as, quote, two great powers. In 2014, former President Obama notably referred to Russia only as a, quote, regional power, a dig that has stuck with Putin. Today's summit was held in the same place that President Ronald Reagan and the former Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, held their first meeting in 1985. The two leaders began with their chief diplomats at their sides, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The talks then expanded to include senior officials from each side, including White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Russian state media posted this photo of the meeting. After about 3 hours, Putin and Mr. Biden concluded the summit. That was shorter than the 4 to 5 hours that U.S. officials had said it would go.
Kind of after 2 hours there, we looked at each other like, okay, what next?
In a striking joint statement, the two nuclear superpowers also agreed, quote, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The leaders decided to hold separate press conferences. Putin went first. When he was pressed on the jailing and killing of his political opponents, he invoked the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol.
As for who is killing whom or throwing people in jail, people came to the U.S. with political demands. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. Some people died, and one of the people that died was simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, this same thing happens that happens in our country. I would like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country.
In his own press conference, I questioned President Biden about those very statements.
He said the reason why he's cracking down on opposition leaders is because he doesn't want something like January 6th to happen in Russia. And he also said that he doesn't want to see groups formed like Black Lives Matter. What's your response to that, please?
That's a ridiculous comparison. It's one thing for literally criminals to break through cordon, go into the Capitol, kill a police officer, and be held unaccountable. And it is for people objecting and marching on the Capitol and saying, you are not allowing me to speak freely.
President Biden said he addressed a range of issues in the meeting.
He knows I will take action.
Mr. Biden said he gave Putin a list of critical U.S. infrastructure that should be off the table for attacks. The president said he raised Russia's military aggression in Ukraine and the poisoning and jailing of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. As to when the U.S. will see whether Putin received Biden's message today,
we'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters. We'll find out.
And Yamiche joins me now from Geneva. Hello, Yamiche. So after all is said and done, what were the biggest takeaways from this summit, and how have President Biden and President Putin been characterizing it?
Well, the biggest takeaway from this historic summit is that President Biden really did strike a much different tone than his predecessor, former President Donald Trump. Remember in 2018 in Helsinki, Finland, President Trump at the time even said that he would take the word over Russia over U.S. intelligence agencies who said that Russia was meddling in the 2016 presidential election and had meddled. This time around, President Biden was firm. He said that there would be grave consequences if Russia meddled in our elections and if there was continued ransomware attacks. He even said, while there were no overt threats, he said specifically to the Russian president, he said that if you wouldn't like if your infrastructure was attacked, you wouldn't like if the oil fields were hit here. The other thing to note, though, is that both leaders said that this was a constructive meeting, that there was no overt hostility. So overall, it seems like this was a successful meeting for President Biden. The other thing to note, though, is that the Russian president still took no responsibility for these criminal gangs that have been carrying out these attacks on U.S. infrastructure. That's a space that we're going to have to continue to watch because there was no real movement when you look at President Putin's statements today.
And Yamiche, as has been reported, another major focus from these meetings was human rights. Tell us more about what came out on that front.
Well, both leaders said that there were some gains, but there was also tension that you could feel and that was clear here on the ground in Switzerland. And the core of that was these human rights differences between President Biden and President Putin. Now, President Putin really had no change in the way that he spoke about Alexei Navalny. He wouldn't even say his name, of course, that being the opposition leader that is jailed in Russia. And President Biden said he went and talked to President Putin specifically about Navalny, saying that there would be devastating consequences for Russia if that opposition leader died. Another thing to note is that President Putin, when he was pressed on human rights issues, he invoked January 6th, saying in all effect that the United States has its own problems with crime, with Black Lives Matter, in some ways spreading disinformation about that group. And when President Biden responded to that, he said that was ridiculous. And he said, look, there's a big difference between people breaking into the U.S. Capitol, insurrectionists, he said, and people who want to speak freely and cannot, which is what's happening in Russia.
And so, looking ahead, Yamiche, what is it expected is going to be a result of this meeting? What happens next?
Well, that's the key question here. What is going to come of this summit? What's going to come of these leaders meeting with their aides in these extended hours-long talks? There really is a big question there. President Biden said in 3 to 6 months, it will be clear whether or not there was some fruits out of this summit. But it really, I think, in some ways feels very vague in terms of what are the actual deliverables. I will say, of course, that there is this working group now going on between the U.S. and Russia when it comes to cybersecurity and strategic arms. President Biden, though, said that he got the sense that the Russian president didn't want another Cold War. So that's something that was important. And of course, we highlighted the joint statement that said these two nuclear superpowers, they don't want a nuclear war, that should not happen. So there was in some ways some talk of peace, some real clear talk of peace. But it really is going to be about what happens in the months and weeks from now to see if this really has consequences that we can measure in a real way.
All right, Yamiche Alcindor covering today's meeting between President Biden and Russia's President Putin. Thank you, Yamiche.
Thanks so much.